This your girl, Deja, and welcome back to another installment of Black and Wild, the podcast. This podcast focuses on highlighting underrepresented stories in outdoor spaces, whether that is in the field of conservation or in outdoor recreation. And each episode will consist of conversations between myself and friends who share about their experience in outdoor spaces. In this episode, I connect with a new yet dear friend, Steve. And although we met through work, our friendship and bond has transcended that. Steve shares about his ethnic heritage and what it has been like growing up in America as the child of Vietnamese immigrants. You won't want to miss this, so keep listening. I do want to add that the opinions represented in this episode and on this podcast slash channel do not represent any agency or organization. Let's get into it. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Deja. It's good to see you, my friend.
You too. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've been looking forward to our discussion. And although we have talked about some of these topics in regards to representation and conservation and in public lands, I'm excited to learn more about your story and to hear what else you have to share. 'Cause I know I don't know all of your story. And I think you've had a lot of experience, but I appreciate the representation that you've also provided as well. So, without further ado, I want to give you the space and opportunity to introduce yourself and anything you'd like to share in regards to the theme of this show.
Well, it's again good to see you, my friend. Always in, we only got to know each other for about a week or so earlier in this year, and it was one of the most impactful weeks that I've had in my life, certainly my career. And I know we've kind of gone back and forth, with texting and things like that about having this discussion. And I didn't know that you had this podcast, and then I was reading the description again today. I'm like, yep, this is it. So um, just to see there's so many talented creative people out there, right? And there's so many avenues now for people to share their voice and their experiences, right? And I'm a particularly inquisitive person, and I want to hear your story. I want to hear where you're coming from. um, what inspires you, right? And that curiosity kind of led me to kind of where I'm at today. So, and that's why I think we became quick friends. I remember our conversations, and they were deep, right? They were a lot of fun. We shared gigantic slices of pizza, um, and we also shared a couple drinks. But we also shared some real moments too, right? And we shared personal experiences and fears and aspirations and things like that. And I know we've been, close to each other mentally. It's kind of spiritually ever since. And no, that's why I'm here. And I think, um, for the people listening, I appreciate them taking time to support your channel and the work that you're doing. And hopefully they can find some inspiration and hope from the things that we talk about as well. My name's Steve. I'm originally from outside of Denver, Colorado. Um, I'm very proud that I'm a Vietnamese American. My parents are both from Vietnam, both refugees to the United States. And, the refugee experience is so relevant. And think about the things that are happening across the world now, in every community, literally in this country, right? There are refugees. And that's a pretty unique perspective. And, but also, it's more common than people think, right? It's happened across human history. People have been displaced by war, famine, and things like that. And so I grew up in this community in Denver, post Vietnam, so post 1975. It was one of the refugee communities. And there was a lot of South Vietnamese refugees that came to the United States and other parts of the world. And they settled in cities like, the West Coast and like Los Angeles and Sioux City, Iowa, and New Orleans and Houston and Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C., and then places like Denver. So that's what I knew. I grew up in a Vietnamese community, speaking Vietnamese every single day. And when I was, kind of preparing for this conversation with you, Deja, I was kind of thinking maybe I should introduce myself by what my family calls me, because my family doesn't call me Steve, right? And so I think for a lot of people that can relate to this, identity is a big thing, right? It's so deeply personal, and it impacts literally every aspect of your life, per- personally, professionally, right? And so the American name Steve was given to me like by my half sister. We all have the same mother. And I was very insecure about my name growing up because it's hard to pronounce, right? Um, but in my family, no one calls me Steve. And I actually don't like when they call me Steve, right? So um, I was talking to a friend that also works in public lands, also a person of color, and someone that is an agent of change as well, just like me, you, and a lot of us are. And he said this to me. He's like, "I'm very excited for the day that you reclaim your identity and your name, right?" And I'm like, "Wow." So I'm not quite there yet. I'm getting there. But I'm happy to share with you that my name is Stung, actually, and that's how people very, very close to me know who I am personally, right? And so, that's a part of this life in many ways for a lot of people. You have different identities depending on the setting that you're in, right? And the setting that I was in, as I grew up in the suburbs of Denver, and every day you looked west, you would see the majestic Rocky Mountains, and always thought they were beautiful and mighty, and was very interested in history and thought about Western exploration and indigenous people and communities and things like that. Um, but my entire life growing up, when I meet people or tell people I'm from Colorado, "Oh, you must love skiing. You must love snowboarding. How often are you in the mountains?" And I literally told them, "Never. I've been once or twice." And I had no idea that Rocky Mountain was a national park, right? Or, there were these amazing public spaces that was available for everyone, right? And that wasn't available. I don't know if that we knew that was available to us as well, right? And it's inspired a lot of us, myself, obviously, personally, to pursue a career in education, specifically history, and in really connecting communities, especially underserved communities, to our public land spaces. And I think that's what kind of brought me and you together professionally. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
Ah, Steve. Uh, yeah, you gave me chills when you mentioned about a friend of yours saying that they look forward to when you reclaim your innermost identity. I thought, oh, that's there's so many layers to that. There's so many emotions behind that, and yeah, thank you for sharing your name with me once again, and
Yeah.
I
It's
appreciate.
interesting. I'm sorry to cut you off there because people try to search for my name, and they're like, "I can't find your email." And I'm like, "Well, Steve's not my name." And they're like, "What?" And I kind of joke with them about that, right? But
Yeah,
you're right. Every time I hear from my family, they call me my name, and it always kind of brings a smile to my face because it's something comforting. It's something that most people don't know about me, right? And so, no, I appreciate that. Reclamation, I think, is a really big deal, right? We talk about reclamation in public lands, but there's a reckoning in this country about history and memory and legacy and ownership and things like that, right? And I think that's for us as individuals as well as community collectively, as a nation, and beyond.
yeah. Well, you always hear, that saying, "What's in a name?" And there's so much, like, names carry so much weight. And no matter who you ask, "Oh, how did you get your name?" There's always a story behind it, some relative, or it has some kind of cultural relevance. Whatever that is, names are so important to our identity and who we are. And it's just, yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little further on how are we connected? How do we know each other?
Yeah, I had the pleasure and honor in many ways to be invited to support a training at Grand Teton National Park, and working especially with youth that were going to be doing internships across the country, happening now, literally, right? Like this summer in 2024. And, it was a really powerful experience for me to be in that space and to meet so many incredible people, like deeply thoughtful people, to hear their stories, to hear where they're coming from, to kind of take a step back in many ways and just listen, right? And I think, as we get older, we kind of forget where people are coming from, and we believe just through maturity and knowledge and experience that we know more, right? We know what's right. And then it was really taking the time to just listen to these incredible young adults. You know, they're adults, right? They really are. And they're experiencing different things in a world that was, I think, dramatically different than when I grew up, right? And with technology and what's going on in the world and in the country as well. And I always thought, well, what I found so inspirational was, as I mentioned, hearing people's perspectives and what they were hoping to find from this, what they were passionate about, and they were very passionate about a lot of things, identity, about climate change, the things that were impacting literally Mother Earth, right, and communities as well, where these people were coming from, and um, that was kind of eye opening for me, and I, as someone that's worked in public land spaces for about over a dozen years now, about a dozen years or so, I never experienced this type of training before, right? To be exposed to not only like career development and different opportunities that these people can pursue, but it was really talking about accessibility and equity and inclusion, right? And that was very, very eye opening for me. As a person that works in this field, that is called on to support these trainings and programs and things like that, that I feel the pressure on that. I put a lot of pressure on myself. Um, and I know when we were talking, it was just at lunch, it was at dinner, it was at meetings, at after action, before sessions started, and we'd just be sharing um, conversations that we had, with some of the students in cohort and things like that. And when you know as I mentioned, I'm Asian American. I'm very, very proud of that. And um, I, I, when I heard a few of the students who are of Asian descent come and speak to me individually afterward and told them how much my story and my just presence meant to them, that was, as you can imagine, that hit me at the core because that's why I've discovered I do this work now, right? As someone that is a very passionate historian, especially I really focus on American history, the Civil War, the African American experience, Asian and Pacific Islanders. Um, I've worked mostly at what we call cultural sites, historic sites, um, but I've really kind of shifted my thinking and towards engagement of representation, right? We talk so much about representation, as you mentioned, just with the work that you do. And that's what really kind of, I kept on talking to you about it throughout the week. I'm like, there's something about this place, there's something about people that are here. And I see, perhaps it's my purpose to continue to engage and connect underserved communities and enhance representation and equity and public lands with as many people as I can. So I see that's kind of where my career is heading, and I find a lot of inspiration in that.
Yeah. Well, I find a lot of inspiration in you, Steve. And I do want to add that that week was a reminder of you never know who you're inspiring by you just living your own truth. I think I might have mentioned that to you during that week
That's
but but you just existing in these spaces, it's you don't know who, maybe they're not telling you verbally in that moment, but they might tell you down the line, that you have inspired them in some way, so by whether you just existing or sharing your story. And so I just want to say I appreciate you and the work that you're doing, and I appreciate the fact that you being a historian, that's being a historian has so much control because you are creating this narrative, right? And the fact that you have really focused your career on highlighting those untold or lesser known stories is so powerful in itself. Like you are just the work that you're doing. I mean, I don't think either one of us will ever know the extent of the effects of the work that you're doing because you're sharing stories that were not known or, little known about them. So thank you for you just being you. I really appreciate it.
yeah, no, that of course that means so much, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But you must explain. This is always from our conversation was, and I think I remember writing this down, is you saying, and you just mentioned it again, living in your truth. And it's one of those things when I hear something like that, I'm like, "Oh, I'm writing that in my phone." I've got these notes on my phone, and when people send me, like my friends and mentors send me things, I always save it, right? And it's something I reflect upon when I need to, right? When you looking for hope and inspiration and trying to get a boost, or you're feeling pretty good, you want to kind of keep the momentum going, right? But I couldn't get that out of my mind when you said living in your truth. And what do you mean by that? I mean, share that with people that may have heard this term or philosophy for the first time.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Hmm. Living in your truth. Yeah, what comes to mind is you just, eh, showing up authentically and shamelessly as yourself, right? Whatever that means, and not feeling as if you need to. Uh, what's the word that you need to? Oh, I'm blanking on the term right now. That you need to change your diction or anything, right? You are just being yourself without even thinking about it. And there's a beauty in that when people are being just so genuine from the heart, it is inspiring. And whatever they're saying or doing, it comes off so authentically that you're drawn to that energy, you're drawn to that person. And I do believe that that week it creates this best atmosphere to inspire folks to be able to show up as authentically themselves. But I noticed too that I wasn't really thinking about how I was acting or what I was saying because I was in a space with other people who came from similar backgrounds that I've come from,
Yeah,
all had to. I mean, it was the discussions we had that week, no matter who it was, leadership or the folks who were interning this summer in public lands, there was a part of everyone's story that I saw myself in. And it
right.
was so beautiful to see how that week just invited everyone to be able to share their own stories. And the other thing I think of too is, showing up authentically in your truth is you don't have to change your identity in any way. You're able to just yeah, you're able to just connect with people like you do with your own friends personally. Like I love my sister and I we brought this up in our episode, but my sister said, "I love seeing Black people just being Black outside." And it's the same thing, no matter what it is. But anyone, I just love seeing folks, whatever feels culturally, ethnically natural for them. I love seeing folks just show up as they do, right? As they feel like
Right.
they can with their friends and their family. And there's a beauty in that. So I hope that helps paint a better picture of what I mean when I say
Yeah,
that.
no, absolutely. And when I see a person that is living their truth, I always compliment them by saying, "I just love your vibe." Right? It's a vibe, right? It's just kind of the way you are. And yeah, there are, as I said, there's moments in atmospheres and things where sometimes you're a bit guarded and things like that. And I think that's what we were really trying to prepare a lot of the interns for. Right? Is this is a really not only safe space, but it's a very supportive space, right? And once you get out there, like a lot of careers and across the spectrum, no matter what you're doing, um, it's a lot different, right? It can be, and maybe that's the reason why we're doing this as well, right? Is maybe it should be the norm, it should not be the exception, right? And I think for a lot of us, that's what we're aiming to do. So, yeah,
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing that comes to mind too is and I'm constantly battling with my identity and my identities in plural, right? Because we have this intersectionality constantly going on within us every day. And I'm always curious about, okay, well, what part of me showing up today in this space or in this
right,
discussion or with this person?
right,
And I've learned to lean into the people that help make me feel comfortable or I can naturally just be myself. And I'll notice after those discussions, I didn't have to code switch. And
right,
as you know, it's like it's become very natural, especially being people of color and
yeah,
having immigrant relatives. It's something that it's just like it's unspoken. It's just taught to us without
yes,
being specifically told that that's the reason why reason why we're being told to act or talk a certain way. And I remember my grandma always instilling this idea into me of, you know, there's a time and place for everything, right? So be careful of what you're saying or how you're acting because you don't want to burn any bridges. And
Right.
and I'm sure she got that from her father, who immigrated from the Philippines, of this idea of assimilating.
Yes.
It was very important to him. I think I might have told you this the week we met, to not teach his children his native language because he didn't want them to be continue to be any look any
Right.
different, act any differently, or be culturally different than their peers because there was gonna be further discrimination. So unfortunately, that's just what we've been taught coming from immigrant relatives is in order for us to be able to succeed and to survive, we have to fit in. And I think that the country we're starting to shift now culturally of wanting to be more accepting of different cultures, but that wasn't the norm for most of American
Uh,
history. And
no, that's actually that's a lived experience that I have, and it's a bit traumatizing for me to think about it. As I said, I grew up, and we obviously just spoke Vietnamese in my household. My parents were learning English, right? And our neighbors were, I guess, Anglo American, or they were white, and they were around our same age group, right? And there's three of them, and it was me and my brother, who's a year older, and then eventually my younger brother, who's about 6 years younger. Um, but they taught us English, right? It was before we even got to school when I started to learn English, and this was at a time where kids are kids, right? I mean, we were mean to each other, and like I see, I work with students a lot, and you see how they talk to each other, like, oh my, that was mean, and it, and I,
um,
and so that was something I was very sensitive about. As I said, my name, um, what I dreaded the most was the first day of school, or if we had a substitute because they didn't know how to pronounce my name, right? And so it was literally not until college. That's how sensitive I was about my name, right? And I literally don't know much Vietnamese anymore. I used to be fluent, right? And in my household, my parents are bilingual now, and so they understood the importance of us learning English, so we could do well in school and go on and have good good paying, careers basically. And that's something that I regret, because people ask me often, they're like, how often have you been to Vietnam? And I said, I haven't gone yet. I've got my siblings and then my parents in the US. That's it. The rest of my family is still back in Vietnam. And other than like social media and stuff, I've never met them. Right. And I want to go. I mean, I would want to go tomorrow. Right. But I'm kind of ashamed of it because I do not want to go home, literally home, and not be able to communicate in Vietnamese, my native tongue, right? And that's something that, I've thought about, working with a tutor and things like that, and I want it to happen. I mean, there are days when my dad calls me and he just speaks to me in Vietnamese and almost forgets that I don't speak it, and I'm like, Dad, I don't even know what you're saying to me right now, right? And that's what I had to sacrifice. I thought, and I think my family felt the same way my parents did, right? And looking back, I wish it didn't happen, right? Because it's one of the I feel that and wherever I go now, if I go to these communities and I go to restaurants and markets and stuff, I can hear some of the things that they're saying. I can understand some of the words, right? Um, and some people recognize that I'm Vietnamese, they'll try to talk to me, and I can't really communicate, right? And so that was something that I gave up, right? That I purposely forgot in order to assimilate, in order to be treated as a human being in many ways, as someone that wasn't different, right? So many of us have this experience that us being different, whether that's your identity, the way you look, the color of your skin, your religion, your cultural background is a bad thing, right? And I think you're right. I feel like we're making strides. We have a long way to go. But that impact, as I said, it's something that is kind of seared in my consciousness, something I think about very often, and I apply it to my work, to engaging with all different sorts of communities and individuals and people and things like that. And yeah, as you said, it's about meeting people in their space and um, uh, in their comfortable areas and how they want to communicate, right? And I find a lot of meaning in that now, right? Because I felt like I gave up a lot in order to just be treated as a person, and it should never be like that.
Wow, Steve. There's a lot of feelings with what you said. Something that comes to mind is, I never, especially being multiracial, I
Yeah.
felt like I didn't fit in with one side of my family or not, and especially my Filipino side, who's very much become Americanized. We've lost a lot of our cultural traditions, and I've always felt as if I'm a social chameleon because I have to adapt to different spaces I'm in.
Yeah.
Part of that was a survival,
Oh,
honestly,
absolutely.
but I'm also because of that, I never feel like I can fit into any one space because I have all these different identities. And I remember in college, I actually intentionally signed up to be a part of a Filipino club in college. And I actually was even on the board and everything. I was a
Oh, cool.
member. I actually was on the culture chair for Samahang Filipino at Sac State. Go Hornets! But
Nice.
shameless plug. But
Indeed.
but I remember a lot of my peers, there was always this feeling that I wasn't Filipino enough,
Mhm.
right? Because I didn't know all of our traditional foods.
Yeah.
I got to learn cultural dances that I'd never seen before because my family had been so disconnected. My great grandfather didn't share any of that with anyone.
Sure.
Of course, I had some of the traditional foods like adobo and
Yeah.
pancit,
Yeah.
but other than that, there's so much that we lost through him immigrating from the
Sure.
Philippines and wanting to make sure that he was setting up his children for success.
Right.
And I remember feeling not Filipino enough so often, as much as I joined the club to try to connect with part of my heritage that I had lost. So my great grandfather passed away. I was actually born on his birthday, and then he passed later that year. So I never got to meet him. And I also was, you know, majored in history when I was in school as well and got my degree in that. So I've always been fascinated about wanting to connect with my culture and my heritage. But it has been really tough to feel like because I don't know a lot of the language. I know some words.
Sure.
Yeah, there's just been a lot that I feel like I've been searching for to reconnect. So I can only imagine how you feel when people recognize that you might be Vietnamese and try to speak to you in the language, and unfortunately you have how bad pressure to feel as if you needed to, almost let go of that language in order to be able to
Yeah.
English properly. And I think we've talked about that too, of the idea of, oh, you're very well spoken for being
Yes.
insert, whatever.
Yeah, I had a visitor tell me that. They said, I'm after I gave a interpretive program, yeah, y thanks, you just gave such a great program. "Oh, I appreciate it. I'm just surprised at how well you spoke English," and it was, like, supposed to be a compliment. Certainly, and it came off like pretty offensive, obviously, right? And I didn't really know how to respond in that situation, right? And I'm trying to exactly remember what I said, but I'm like, "Well, thank you. My name is Steve, and I'm from Denver." It's just like, I grew up in America. I was born and raised here, right? And yeah, so and I was wearing a uniform too, and so that does not always protect you from these comments, both micro and macro aggressions. And I know a lot of people feel that, right? Um, and so I think that's the hard part. One of the hardest things I find about being in public land spaces as a professional is, you know, for example, this month is May, right? It's Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and I've done a lot of work on that with Asian Pacific Islanders in the Civil War and just their impact on this country for centuries, right? And something obviously I'm very proud of the work that I do. Especially working at Civil War sites, it's so deeply personal for a lot of people and their families, and it makes sense, right? We work with descendants from all different backgrounds, from all different places, from battlefields to places of enslavement and liberation, right? I really appreciate meeting people from all different backgrounds that come to these lands, right? These spaces, and I always felt like an interloper, right? Because I never traveled to these sites as a child. A lot of people grow up in these states that the Civil War, you talk about every single day. You see these monuments, they're named, the buildings are named after them. You go to these battlefields and historic sites. I never had that opportunity, right? And so this was really new to me. And when you talk to people that are like, hey, my great great grandfather was here, or my great great grandmother was in this area during the Civil War. I had, like 7 people in my family that served in the Civil War. And I'm just like, I just felt so disconnected, right? And even though I had been studying the conflict since I was a child, and I'm like, how can I find my personal connection to this? And it was going to places like Appomattox and some of these battlefield sites, where I started seeing images of people of color, especially people of Asian descent. And I'm like, wow, like I wonder who this person is, right? The power of an image, right? And then I remember finding a photograph of my father in Vietnam when he was like 19 years old, and he was in the Navy. It was a black and white photo, and I'm like, this is my connection here. Because for our family, my family, for millions of people, Vietnamese, here and then across the world, we've had our own civil war, right? And so I actually kind of started to joke about it. Though I would tell people, yeah, my family fought for the South. And they're like, what? I'm like, South Vietnam. And then we all had this chuckle, right? And so, and as you were kind of mentioning, like a lot of cultures, uh, the elders don't talk about trauma, especially, right? It's something that is kept insular, right? That is not, especially shared with children, right? Especially the one if they're in a new place, if they had to migrate or immigrate or find refuge somewhere. And I think my father talked about serving twice my entire like from all the way up to high school. He never talked about this, right? Never talked about fleeing when he was 19 years old, right? Leaving his homeland for like this unknown place. He didn't know where he was going to go, right? And so when I finally heard about his journey, and it was through another person, it was like heartbreaking, right? And I just thought, you know, to these people that came to the US in the 1850s and 60s and 70s and 80s and long before that from all different parts of the world, right? And the National Park Service did a handbook on Asian and Pacific honors in the Civil War, and I got to participate in that as a graduate student. And I call it my own Civil War because was able to learn more about my own family's history because of the American Civil War. I started asking questions and kind of diving much deeper, right? And so I actually had a person I went to school with comment on like a social media post I did, and it was talking about something related to the Civil War, and he said, and it was quite offensive, why do you talk about this? Your people weren't there. And I was like, wow, right? And so your people, and we hear that comment, right? People hear, you hear that comment, and it's like, what are you implying by that? And I
Mm,
just started posting photos of Asian people of Asian descent that had served in the military during the war, right? And like me, some of them had to anglicize their names, right? There's a shared experience there, right? And so um, that's why I been so I started pursuing this career in history, and then the idea was to be like a high school social studies teacher, and working with young adults, and um, I didn't realize, as I mentioned, I was not connected to historic sites, state, county, national, and battlefields and things like that until I got it deeper into my schooling. And then I got to meet like park rangers and went to all these historic sites, especially in the East. And I'm like, wow, you get to do this every single day. I wonder if there is room for me in this. And
mm,
I'm still wondering that, Deja. I still am. So, no matter how much impact I feel like I can make and how much people tell me I'm doing, I never fully feel secure in my position. And that's hard, right? And that's something that I shared with you recently when I saw you in person when we met for the first time after a few days. Like, I don't know if I can keep on doing this history stuff because I don't feel like I have a place, right? And so that's the raw part that I wanted to share with you. And I know we've talked about this before, but with the listeners as well, people that I think can relate to this, no matter what field they're in. You become a professional, right, and you pursue this with passion and vigor and a lot of empathy, right, and then that's not always. reciprocated, right? And that's kind of where I find myself right now. Is I'm a bit I feel unsettled in my place as a historian, right? And remember what you were saying to me? I'll never forget this. You were like, I kept on saying to you, I'm like, I can't do this history anymore. Like, it's just it's too hard. I've got I feel the pressure, and I'm not sure if I'm really welcome. I'm like, I just want to move out west and work at these go to these big parks and work with youth and engage in engage with communities, especially underserved and underprivileged communities and things like that. And I remember Deja, you're like, you can still do both, and I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point, and so you kind of talked me off the ledge there, but so like a lot of things, your emotions kind of ebb and flow, you know what I mean? And so there are moments where I find a lot of inspiration, and I always find inspiration in the work that I try to pursue and the conversations and the relationships that I build and people build with me and the places that I work and things like that, right? But it's also incredibly difficult as well, right? And I think it's a lot of us have to kind of internalize it, and I think us having this conversation, as you said, should be normalized, like I think this is from what we've kind of experienced and heard from other people, this is not an uncommon thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, thank you so much for sharing, Steve. I appreciate you sharing that project you worked on while you were in college. I was wondering if we could backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
Touched on this in a couple times in different ways, but how did you actually end up in your specific career, and how did you end up visiting some of these sites that you never visited as a child? Like, what
Yeah.
led up to this, and your lead up to where you started getting doing the work that you are doing now?
Absolutely, and it actually kind of relates to the work that we did together, both collectively, individually, with this cohort of intern. Is mentorship, and I saw this at the undergraduate level. I've been very, very passionate about history, and as I mentioned, my parents worked so hard. My father worked like 7 days a week, right? And we went on like I literally remember going on one vacation when I that my entire like childhood, right? And that's because he was always at work, right? And then my mom worked as well, and for years she took care of the children, us, and so it was kind of all work, no play type mentality, right? And so I would just learn and read books and watch documentaries and things like that, and I became increasingly more fascinated about the conflict and about history in general. When I went to college, as I mentioned, I had this plan with my best friend that we were going to be social studies teachers and we're going to coach sports together, and that was the plan, right? And for both of us, we've gone in kind of different directions, right? Take different roads, right? And he's an educator and he's also a coach and he's like a poet and he's like a civil rights activist in many ways, a social activist, right? He does so many different things. Um, and I feel like I'm an educator too, right? I kind of do it in a different classroom in many ways, right? But I remember talking to my mentor in graduate school, and he's like, "There may be something here." I'm like, "What do you mean by that?" He's like, "I think you might want to keep on pursuing history, keep on going with this. This could take you somewhere." And they had this kind of what they called the semester program at Gettysburg College, right? And it was like a semester of immersion into what they call Civil War studies, and you'd be on campus at the school there. You take classes, and then literally every weekend you went to a historic site, a battlefield. Washington. We went to D.C. and Richmond and all these places. That's the first time I met park rangers, and I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool. This is pretty cool. So I'm like, that's when the light kind of came on, right? When I realized, I'm like, I think I want to do this, right? I want to work kind of outside of the traditional classroom, right? Work in these historic spaces, these places that are preserved by people, by us, by local, state, federal, whatever that may be. And I was really inspired to kind of pursue this, right? And that's kind of what's led to my career today, right? Is went to graduate school and started working at these historic sites, mostly Civil War sites, but African American sites as well, and a Native American or American Indian site too. And that's what's kind of led me to this, right? And I think, in the past few years, it's just kind of evolved with really engaging in um, when I talk about equity, it's equity of not only getting uh, people's stories told, but they are the ones that tell the story. That, we are here to help be the land stewards, but sometimes it's actually our job just to get the heck out of the way, right? And these people are, a lot of these communities are, a lot of the people that live in these communities have been there for generations, you know what I mean? And I think often, you know, um, professionals try to come in these spaces and be like, "Hey, we're here to tell your story." Like, yeah, not necessarily, right? It's we're here to hopefully um, collaborate with you, have you a part of the planning and development process to preserve, interpret, protect these sites and things like that, right? And so that's where I found great meaning. I worked in DC for about 5 years, and wow, what a city, right? And such an incredible place with people from all over the world, right? And I was particularly drawn to the African American history there, and um, it's the nation's capital. And once you get beyond like the National Mall and the monuments and these museums and all the government buildings, there are communities there, right? And then you start understanding, um, you start feeling a vibe, right? And you understand pride, and you understand how people have been forgotten about as well, purposely or sometimes mistakenly, right? And I think that's what's been my mission, is to learn and to listen and to amplify people's perspectives and experiences. And yeah, I think that's a part of why we connected so quickly. It's like, yeah, I think you meet people right in your life, you're like, wow, this person, is an agent. Well, I like the term agent of change, but I'm for me, it's even much more simpler, Deja. I'm just truly fascinated and inspired by people that are very passionate, right? No matter what they do. And I think when we met each other and we were in this place, and with the work that we're doing today, right, is there's a lot of inspiration, there's a lot of passion there, right? And I think it's the opportunity for us to have this conversation, to share it with others, is and then for them to share it with us. I'm hoping to hear feedback, and hopefully, we can hear from other people as well, and have them, relate to us, but share their hope and aspirations as well. So yeah.
Well said, Steve. And that's a big part of why I wanted to start this show, this podcast, was because oftentimes when our stories are being told, it's usually by other people or it
Right.
can in performative spaces,
Yeah.
right? And like again, how many? I know you mentioned this before, but how often do you get reached out to every time May is coming up
Right.
to exactly represent
Yeah.
for Asians in public lands? And it's really frustrating because we shouldn't have these discussions just in the month of May about Asians
Right.
representing or in Black, during February for Black History
Right.
Month. I want to have these discussions with other people who are people of color who have similar stories on
Right.
a regular basis.
Right.
But also, I think it matters to hear examples of people who have explored careers in conservation and public lands.
Yeah.
I didn't really get those examples when I was younger. And I remember, yeah, my first time going to a national park was through a school field trip. And then I
Yeah.
never forget meeting some of my mentors and then thinking, oh, okay, not only do people come and recreate here and spend time here, but because I never went to national parks on vacation growing up either,
Right.
and so I thought, oh, but we can also live and work in beautiful places and then share this with
Right.
people. Wait a second, there's something to this. So I appreciate hearing that in your story too, as we have that similar connection. I do want to add that we also connected on R&B, and every time I think about
Yes. That's
I think
right.
about where we had that sing along in the car on the way.
Oh my gosh, that was great.
Know that was a side note, but I just wanted to say, Steve, that I appreciate all the levels and ways that we've been able to connect. And
Yeah.
honestly,
When we parked the rental and we just stayed and just continued to jam out the R&B. I'm like, yeah, this is it. So that was such a
Our bond was solidified in that moment,
well, yeah, that was it. That was it.
among other moments during that week where we connected. But yeah, I just Steve, I appreciate this. There's like almost a familial kinship that I feel with you, but also, other people that I've connected to who are doing good work, and I love that term agent of change, agents of change. I notice I'm drawn to other people who are also doing work that is inspiring, even if it's not related to the specific work that I'm doing or the field that I'm involved in. I just appreciate people who are living their truth, but
Yeah,
are, doing whatever that's professionally or personally, they're involved in something that is fulfilling for them and rewarding. There's something about that I think enough can't be said on that topic. So I just wanted to add that I appreciate that about you. And I was wondering, you mentioned your focus on wanting to connect with underrepresented, marginalized communities in these spaces. And I appreciate that you touched on that because you don't often hear that when it comes to public lands. It's said that those are usually the reasoning behind certain promotions when it comes to, the public free days or
yeah, sure, sure.
however, it always feels like it's a one-off, right? It's not always a part of every day. And so I'm wondering, what has your experience been like throughout your career? Did you feel welcome? Did you feel that you saw yourself represented by other people who lent a hand to you and why you're where you are today? What has that been like for you?
Yeah, that's a really powerful and important question, right? And something that I think a lot of us grapple with almost on a daily basis, right? Depending on where you go, how you navigate spaces, and how you represent yourself and the work that you do and things like that. I think it's a mix. It's a mixed bag. It can be depending on where you're at. I spent 5 years in DC, so it was an urban space, right? And I felt comfortable there in many ways. I felt like that it was not only could I project my voice, but there were a lot of other voices from around the world that I was so fascinated in hearing, right? And I lived in a row house with like seven roommates, right? So I felt like I was in college again. It was intense. And that was kind of the good, the bad, the ugly. But my gosh, I met people from literally all over the world, right? And one of my really good friends, he's from India, right? And he was in the United States on a work visa, and it was just, you know, it was so interesting, just getting to know him and his cultural, I wouldn't say differences. It's just like what he found, what he grew up on, right? And how it was, I was sharing this with a friend recently. He was big in the sports, and one day he was wearing like a Yankees hat and like a New England Patriots shirt. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, well, that's what I saw on TV back in India. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, and I kind of give him a hard time about that, right? But it was just really kind of funny to learn, about like how he saw the United States, right? Well, what I really appreciated about him was he was kind of fearless and literally would just book a flight, right? And he was like, "I'm going to Maine." I'm like, "To do what?" He's like, "Oh, I want to go to Acadia National Park." I'm like, "By yourself?" And he's like, and he didn't have a license or anything. He just figured it out, right? And so, but I remember being with him certain times when he being two people of color, and I felt like in a restaurant or something, and I felt like people were looking at us, people like kind of talk to us differently. And so I've had that experience a lot in my life, right? And I was very sensitive to that, and I was very sensitive to that with my parents as well. I'd be very close to my parents when we went to like a store or something because I saw the way people treated them. Because if they didn't speak English very well or the people couldn't understand, I would speak for them. And it's like and that was always really really big with me. And it's like they deserve your respect as well. You know what I mean? And I felt like I didn't want my parents to feel like they were not equals, right? That they didn't deserve respect because they couldn't speak a certain language, right? Or they couldn't speak it well, right? And so Well, when I've been in these spaces as a professional, especially in public lands, there are moments where I feel like I'm very proud to be the only person of color, right, that's doing some of this work. But that also applies a lot of pressure too, right? I think internally, but also externally as well, right? As I said, I get a lot of calls and emails in May to come and talk about Asians. I'm like, well, I'm Asian every day, and this is my this is it's a very there's so many different cultures, of course, but for me, my Vietnamese American culture is incredibly important to who I am. And then my knowledge of Asian and Pacific Islanders in this country, I can talk about this next month as well, right? And as you mentioned, this is our history. It's individual, but it's collective, and I understand why we have these heritage months and things like that, right? And so I don't like to write posts about this month each year, but I feel like I'm obligated to do it because I think it's so important for people to hear our stories, right? Does that make sense? So that's a lot on me, and that's the tension that I feel with myself a lot. Am I perpetuating this, right? That in every May, Steve always writes a post about Asian and Pacific Islanders, right? And I always write it on the first day, right? And it's generally a photo of my family, right? And I always say, we are Vietnamese, we are American. This is the American dream, right? And then I always say, like, Asian and Pacific Island Heritage Month. Um, but I don't know if that would be okay if I did that every single month. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I'm kind of caught in that conflict, right? And I've heard visitors tell me often I've never seen a person in uniform like you, right? I think that can be good and bad, right? Sometimes it really is a compliment. Other times I'm like, wow, that's not good. I want the public land agencies and organizations to reflect the diversity of this country, right? And we're just not there. We're not there, right? And I think the one thing I struggle with a lot of my colleagues is, um, especially, biracial people of color, is there's this pressure to, um, I call it like this kind of dual consciousness, right? It's like, um, you're supposed to be this and you're supposed to be this at the same time as well, right? And it's a lot, and I just call it pressure, right? And it's kind of something that it's hard to get away from, right? And I'm hoping that, well, I have, there are moments. It's sounds like I'm pretty pessimistic about it, and that moments I have been, because even in uniform, that has not shielded me from outright discrimination and racism, right? From the gentleman told me that he was surprised that I spoke English well, to the woman that accused me of being illegal because it just, for some reason, me wearing a uniform was, and as a person of color, however she saw me physically was a threat, and she accused me of being illegal, and it was traumatic, right? It was something that stayed with me, still continues to stay with me, and it was actually, I was talking about my colleague, my friend, that he was the one that was talking about reclaiming my name someday, right? And we actually had just shot a Juneteenth video together, right? And you can imagine, we're very proud of it. It was, and this was just as Juneteenth was becoming a federal holiday, right? And we had been doing work before it became a federal holiday, and it was something that was deeply personal to us. And I was feeling very inspired, right? We call that interpretive high. You remember that, as being a frontline interpreter. And then I went to get lunch afterward, and I was spoken to in that manner. It completely undercut me, right? And I was devastated. I was angry. I was ashamed in many ways. I'm like, and it's when I shared that experience with certain people, like, I never would have allowed that to happen. I'm like, how do you know that, right? And that's the part that really upset me too. I'm like, am I going to confront this person and like create a scene here, right? As I'm in my uniform, and things like that. Like, no, that's not going to happen. So, as you mentioned, we have to make decisions, right? And I literally I felt like a smaller person at that time, but I just had to leave. Okay. And the person basically also took my plate down. Like, they took my license plate number down, or, like I saw them writing. I'm like, oh my gosh. Right. And so, um, I remember going home. I actually talked to the park supervisor, and I really appreciate the call from this person, and they're like, "I think you should go home," because I couldn't focus, right? I was just like, I was so upset, and I got home and I just kind of sat on the kitchen table or at the dining room table for a couple hours. I'm like, should I even write about this, right? And I'm like, maybe I don't want to, I don't want people feeling sorry for me and all this stuff, but I'm like, something needs to be said, right? And I wrote I wrote a post about my experience, and hundreds of people commented, right? And what I appreciate is not just obviously expressions of support, and empathy and love, but I'm s- it was the comments that said, "I'm surprised that this would happen in this time of day," or I'm like, "Are you sure?" That's why we're having this conversation, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I wanted to share this traumatizing experience as just an example that um I feel like I'm so thoughtful and inspired in the work that I do. And then it can be cut just by a couple words, you know what I mean? Or by the way people look at you. Um, Micro and macro aggressions as well. We've learned that from staff that we supervise are like interns and um, kind of, it's not just external, it's like internal as well. And often we have found, especially with people of color, is it's internalized. You don't want to be the one causing an issue, right? And so, who do you talk to if you're at a park and you're the only person there that is represented, right? As a certain race or gender, or um, identity, right? And that's where we're still, I think, struggling in all agencies, all places of employment. I'm not just talking about public land spaces, but that's something that I think progress, of course, we have a long way to go, right? And I'll share with you quickly. I think when I think of progress, I think of, as I said, equity, right? And just this idea of also empathy as well. I remember observing a training at Grand Teton National Park, actually, and I was just there to kind of see what was going on. And it was onboarding season, right? And park was preparing for obviously millions of visitors, and um, there was an entire training session on uh, Chinese visitors, people of Chinese descent, people that came from China to visit parks. And I just kind of sat back. I'm just like, I immediately thought about my family. I'm just like, and what I really appreciated about this is it just said cultural norms there are different here, right? Um, and they had like brochures and packets that were in Mandarin, and it just very, very thoughtful, right? But I appreciate them taking time to educate and train the staff on, there are visitors from around the world that come to this site, right? And just the fact that there has been some sort of discussion about, where these people are coming from. You might not have a full conversation with them. Who knows? You could. But the fact that they deserve respect as well as anyone else from this country in our country that comes and visits our site, right? And so when I see things like that, I was really, really impressed um, that these discussions are being had, right? That these perspectives and um, these people that people from all different backgrounds can come to these public land spaces and be treated the way they should be, right? And I don't think that was always the case. If you saw some of the reports that were done recently, official reports of segregation at like national park sites, right? That's real, right? And there's a legacy of that in public land spaces and agencies, right? And I think uh, parks and agencies are still grappling with that. And there are communities that still live around public land spaces that don't feel welcome, right? Um, and there's a reason why for that, right? And I think, yeah, that's a discussion that is so deeply entrenched, right? And it's a part of our history, our the good and the bad of this country, right? The hypocrisy of kind of what's this country has been built upon with racism, discrimination, and things like that, right? And of course, that impacted public land spaces, right? And so Not surprised that underrepresentation and inequality also impacts spaces like that. So many people find inspiration, if that makes sense.
No, definitely, Steve. Yes, you touch on so many good points that are valid, honestly. And
Yeah.
something that came to mind of what you said and what I took away from it was the idea that I got from people of color growing up that people that look like us, we don't do those things, right? We don't go to,
Right.
not something that we do.
Right.
And I couldn't help, but also something else that you said, but think about, well, not only are we perpetuating that by repeating this idea, but where did that come from? And
Right.
that's probably the systemic racism that we experience in these
Right.
spaces when literally we were not allowed to
Not loud.
recreate in these spaces or to go to areas that are public, but certain groups were not welcome. And literally, there were sometimes laws that prevented people from being able to have these experiences and visit these locations. So I can't help but wonder sometimes if these ideas that are planted into our heads about the way that we view ourselves or people of other people of color in general I'm like, that doesn't come from that's not how I think and feel, right? And I can't help but wonder, okay, where have I heard that where now it sounds like it's my voice in my head and my own
Right.
but actually it's because the seed has been planted from whatever you might have learned in school or whatever you see on advertisements and commercials. That I remember when I was working in uniform, and I don't remember if I told you this or not, but I wonder if I did tell you, but I'll tell you now. There were these ladies who came up to me who were white, and I remember them asking me, "How did someone like you end up here?"
Wow.
And I kind of again, so what do you mean someone like you?
Yeah. Right.
And then they elaborated on saying, well, we're from Washington, D.C. And they said, but where we come from, Black people don't even touch grass. They don't even like to go into the outdoor spaces and be outside. And I thought, wow. Great job. You are trying to create this stereotype. And one, you are now comparing me to the few Black people that you have interacted with, and that we must all think and feel and act
Right.
the same way.
Right.
But at the same time, I thought this is an opportunity here. This is an
Yes.
opportunity to have a discussion. And of course, I could have reacted in a number of ways that probably would have been fair based off of those very insensitive comments made. But I couldn't also help but think not only am I proud to be in uniform and representing for other people of color to see someone else who looks similar to them, or at least different than what we see normally in public lands, but it's also for people who are not BIPOC. It's
Right.
important for them to see that there
Right.
there is more cultures or ethnicities that exist and that deserve to be in these spaces too, and that we're not always welcome, but we are here and we are also finding ways to connect with these spaces that feel natural to us based off of our experience and our worldviews. So, thank you for
Boom.
what you shared because not
Yeah.
only is this important for us to have this discussion for other people of color, but also people who are
Yes.
not of color to know that we deserve to be here, but also we don't always feel welcome. And as much as we've had the civil rights movements and certain laws have been passed, certain initiatives have been put into place,
Yeah.
there's so much that has occurred culturally and systemically within our country that needs to be undone. And yes, we have made strides, but the work isn't over yet. Right. And a lot of that became apparent during 2020 when
Right.
those protests highlighted what we already knew was happening in people of color communities for decades, in regards to police discrimination and the list goes on. But it was a good reminder that we're not done yet. And we need to continue to have these discussions and highlight these instances where people are being mistreated. And at the end of the day, we all deserve to be treated like human beings, right? We all deserve
Absolutely.
respect, just like you mentioned with your parents, regardless of how they're speaking or their appearance. We are human beings at the heart.
Absolutely. And you know what was kind of getting back to when we first met and being around that cohort, I'm so used to doing history and being around people interested in history, right? And Just like any field, right? When you meet people with the same passions, you're around those people a lot, right? And that's been one of the most fulfilling things about pursuing this career, and really this life is I've met so many wonderful people. Um, if I happen to, my initial plan, I was going to stay in Colorado, right? And now, I've lived in several different states across the country, and um, I'm a better person for it, right? Just from these interactions and these friendships and relations that have developed, and what I found, again, I use the word inspiring so much, but it really opened my eyes is when I heard the cohort share what they were passionate about, right? Especially with public lands. And I was like, right, and that was a perspective that I didn't have growing up, right? I grew up in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, but for me, I didn't know about public land. I didn't know about national parks, state parks, county parks, and things like that, right? I didn't know that you could go to historic sites across the country and learn about different perspectives and stories, right? And so my view was narrow and a bit cloudy because I was just not exposed to it. And just to hear these interns or these people, young people that are going to go into their internships across the country, and them being so passionate about public lands, especially natural resources, right, was a big thing for me, and especially being in that setting, and that gets me thinking. I'm hopeful because of some of the people that we know, and some people that I don't even know that. I'm thinking about social media, right? You have so many, and I'll say positive influencers that, brown people camping, right? My good friend manages that. And I remember meeting her in Washington, D.C., and she literally uh, helped me. We organized a hike together, and there were literally people that took the train down from New York City to be there, right? It was incredible to hear people's stories. There was a gentleman um, of American Indian or indigenous descent that was in the U.S. military, and he was a career soldier as well, and made this comment at the end, and it was 'cause at every stop we just started sharing about who we are, why we were here, right? I talked about my father actually, and this person talked about how his entire life he was not allowed to really be proud of his heritage, his lineage as American Indian or of an indigenous background, right? And he shared that, and people were bawling, right? And you know what brought us together? That public land space, right? And so that's what I'm very hopeful about, right? Is when you see people that are, as you said, true to themselves in these spaces, um, that have this positive, truly positive reach, and that they are showing. You're right. Not only people of color, biracial people, people of all different identities and backgrounds, but the people that might be insecure or might not want to see this happen. We're here. We're going to keep on coming out to these spaces because they are a part of who we are as well, right? We have ownership in this place as well, and I think I don't know. Am I hopeful enough, or am I not? Where are you at on this?
Kind of like what you mentioned earlier, Steve. I go back and forth,
Yeah,
and having these discussions, continuing to have these discussions with other folks has been truly inspiring.
yeah.
And really working with these young adults and their passion and enthusiasm gives me hope for
Yes,
the future. I had even been asked by one of the members in the cohort who identifies as a white cis hetero male.
yeah.
He asked me, how can I continue to create these kind of spaces for people to feel welcome in public lands?
Wow. Ooh, okay.
I did not
Yeah,
obviously, I didn't ask him to do that, but he came away from that week by being in a diverse space and hearing other people's stories that are different from his own, but yet he felt connected with them in ways because they obviously had shared interest and passions and
yeah,
goals. He was able to be inspired to think about wanting to create those opportunities more often. So there's moments like that that inspires me. There's moments like what you described and how that ignorant woman
Uh,
judge you based off of your appearance. That reminds me that we are not as far along as
right.
I'd like us to be. But you know, I do try to be as optimistic as possible while balancing the line of being a realist as well.
Sure.
I think we need to have a safe balance of the two.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I try to be as well, right? And I think when you're in that very insular space that we were in, right? I mean, it's easy to find inspiration and hope, right? Um and optimism. And then when you step outside, and I think that's as we were talking about earlier, that was our hope is to understand that this is kind of a unique space, and once you go to whatever site that you work at, it's going to be different, right? And the atmosphere is going to be different, and the conversations you have might be different, and the way people look at you and treat you can be different, right? And I hope you've got the skills and know that you have the support group that has your back as well, right? And so, and that makes me think. We talk a lot about accessibility, and one of the things I think so much about is financial accessibility. If we talked about underserved, communities, marginalized communities, and we talk about some of these iconic natural land spaces, right? Public land spaces, it's not easy to get to Alaska. It's not easy to get to, Yosemite and Glacier and, these state sites, these national forests and things like that. You do work where you're engaging with youth, providing opportunities to um, not only for these individual people, but it's also for these organizations as well, right? To look a little bit deeper, right? To kind of live up to their creed of diversity and equity and inclusion. And how's that process been from you for your experience uh, as a frontline person, right? To what you're doing now, getting youth involved in these, being the next generation of public land stewards.
Really great question, Steve. Yeah. What I have found is that there are these initiatives in place to want to diversify public lands and conservation. So wanting to really not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk.
Right, right.
Now, where I'm hitting a wall, and that has become apparent to me, especially working in my specific position for the last year, is that yes, we are advertising that we really want people from marginalized or underrepresented backgrounds to apply to these positions. And you're seeing that across the board, other
Sure.
organizations and
Yeah.
businesses. It's not
Yeah.
we're seeing that, but what I'm finding is that okay, great, we are hiring these folks because, of course, there's also numbers. Numbers matter, and we're
Yeah.
trying to get a certain quota to make sure that we are proving that we are actually doing the work to support this initiative that has been put into place. However, I'm not seeing any resources or support beyond that. So we are placing these people in these positions, but what are we doing to support them when they're coming across microaggressions, when
Yeah.
they are being transplanted to locations that are sometimes very different from what they are used to in
Mm.
regards to how they grew up, the community they grew up in, their
Right.
culture, etc. I'm not seeing that. And so although and someone mentioned this actually during that week in Grand Teton, there was a question asked of, but what are we doing to actually retain these folks in this career, right? We are giving them these opportunities and introducing them to these career paths and these options, but what are we doing to make sure that they do feel supported and they have the resources to succeed? And that
Right.
I'm seeing a disconnect.
Okay.
So I've definitely been posing those questions and challenging, the organizations that I work with and work for of, but what can we do to take it a step further? Right. And I often wonder sometimes if it's like you said earlier, I don't stop being black, after I clock out. Um,
Right.
as much as this is trying to create more representation in outdoor spaces and conservation is a part of the work that I do. It's also very personal because I
Definitely.
do that personally
Right.
as well. So it is something that I obviously work on personally and professionally all the time. But yeah, I continue to ask those questions, and I often wonder if someone was in this position instead of me and didn't come from the background that I come from and is not coming from a marginalized community, would they be asking these questions, or would they just continue to meet that the status quo, hit those numbers, and make sure that we are hiring people from certain backgrounds and then leaving and then stopping there, right?
Sure.
Because if we stop there, we're not doing any service to these initiatives, and also the work to really make sure these spaces are feeling equitable and inclusive. Not just looking diverse, but what are we really doing to make sure that these people feel welcome in these spaces beyond just this one-off position or opportunity?
Right. Well,
Um,
no, I think that's spot on. I think that's kind of the dilemma right now. And there are very, very inspired, thoughtful, empathetic people that are still trying to determine that. It's not easy. Obviously, there's not one solution, right? And I think it's something that, as I said, it impacts so many different fields, right? And it's not just public land spaces. It's almost every aspect of this of certainly our country for sure. And so as people try to navigate this, I yeah, I don't know. I struggle with this as well, right? As I as you said, you don't turn this off, right? I mean, I'm not when I leave work, I'm still who I am. You know what I mean? I might not be. Uh, I'm no longer, I guess, working, right? But who I am as a person, the way I look, where I come from, that doesn't change, right? And so um, yeah, I think that's a point that we can't answer that, right? I just kind of wanted to throw that out there from your perspective and the work that you do, and because I think a lot about um, the people that we connected with in that cohort, and you still talk to these people weekly, right? And it's been a couple months now, and I'm just like, I wonder how they're doing, you know what I mean? And I think obviously social media and thing like that, that provides, a little bit of an insight of how things are going, you know what I mean? But um, yeah, it's once you leave, that certain kind of security of that space, right? It's like, okay, now we're kind of back, right? And it's the process of me navigating that myself is difficult, right? Moving from an urban center like DC to a much smaller place. I guess in a way, a rural place. The transition has been much more difficult than I thought it would be, right? And um, that's been one of the hardest things about this transition for me over the past few years is um, not feeling comfortable in this space, right? And that's hard, when you work in public land spaces and then you come home and you don't feel secure, you don't feel the most comfortable. You don't have your kin or your tribe. I like to say that your tribe around, right? And when I was in DC, that um, I could find that anywhere, right? And or I knew where to find that, and it was something I didn't have to really search for. It was, I guess, developed over a 5 year span, right? But here, I immediately fell out of place, right? And that's what I think about with a lot of these public land spaces, not only for people that work in it, but the people that go to these places, right? As you mentioned, not just urban versus rural, right? But it's, as I mentioned, it's hard to get to a lot of these places. You have to have financial backing to go to these places,
yeah,
and yeah, are you going to be treated a certain way? That's not that's real. That's a real question, right? And I remember being at a really big park in, I think, Montana during COVID, and it was on native tribal land, and COVID had decimated so many of these tribal, indigenous communities, and they owned this land. It was a gas station, right? And um, this person came in and they had, they said they asked the person to wear a mask. If you don't have one, we'll give it to you. And this person threw a fit. and was so disrespectful, right? And I was kind of, the person. It was over within a few seconds, right? But I was upset. I can imagine how these people felt. Um, this is their place, right? And the impact not only with COVID on these communities, but also, um, the impact that European born illnesses, I mean, historically they wiped out native communities for centuries in the North America, right? And for me, that was kind of the cognitive dissonance, right? I know that was kind of my history mind kind of clicking on when I was in that space, but I'm like, that was hard to see that, right? And these lands are, a lot of these lands are built on indigenous land, established, preserved, so I know that's a much deeper conversation that we can dive in at another point, but I just think about that situation because um, that person walked into a space, literally, it was a nation. It was literally another nation, right? And they treated these people with such disrespect and disdain. And these people aren't on vacation that work there. This is their livelihood, you're right? And that's how they were treated. So what if what if the roles were reversed? You know what I mean? And I want, I was kind of, that'd be kind of interesting the way that worked, right? And so, but I think about that. You made the best point about that. I think so much about representation from people that work in these spaces, but it's also if it's well represented, maybe that means visitation will be well represented as well, right? So, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts?
Well, I've had a few conversations with different folks or even listened to other discussions where
Yeah,
there has been this idea of really challenging some of these uh, businesses or folks in the industry to really walk the walk, right? Don't just say that you are in support of diversifying these spaces, but really provide the opportunities so people who come from underrepresented backgrounds can have a chance to be able to explore what opportunities are available to them
yeah,
in ways that make
yeah,
it accessible to them for whatever means, right? And so I have had some folks come up with the idea of, well, what if there are opportunities for people who've never gone camping before, for
yeah,
example? And
yeah,
because that's an investment. This
yeah.
is it's a luxury to be able to visit public lands, to be honest,
Right. It is. It's a privilege.
but there's usually expenses involved that's just something that the average American family, especially who come from marginalized backgrounds, just they can't even begin to consider that because usually both parents in the home are working and
Right.
they're trying to just survive every day, let alone think about going on a vacation to a place that
Yeah.
not advertised really to us. And so they had suggested maybe like REI, for example, could put on, weekends where they actually give, demos of how to use certain gear, how do you set up a tent,
Yeah.
or, and even be able to like rent out some of this gear so that people can test it out and see if this is something they want to do. I do want to
Oh,
touch
I
on,
like that. That makes sense.
right? And then you are also creating consumers because if
Yeah.
people actually are able to try out something that otherwise they don't even know if it's a worthwhile investment for them and the benefits that could come from being able to spend time in these places, they don't even know what the possibilities are because they don't have the opportunities to even think in that way, for whatever reasons, economically, socially,
Right.
etc. And I do want to touch on this organization called Hoods to Woods that's based out of New York. Have you heard of them?
Cool. I don't, maybe yeah, please explain more. As I know there's a lot of great organizations doing amazing work. So,
Yeah, so I'll have to share their episode of them featured on the Bomb Hole podcast, which is a podcast that's focused on snowboarding and
oh,
this
okay.
culture. But the reason why I mentioned Hoods to Woods is that they are a nonprofit organization started by two men of color who are from New York. And they're all about introducing snowboarding essentially to inner city kids.
Oh, cool.
They kind of tell their story of how growing up it was, that same idea of, well, people who look like us don't go to these spaces
Yeah.
and do these type of
Yeah.
sports. Or
Right.
right? Where is that going to lead you? But they had found so much, they've been able to receive so much by having those experiences and being able to snowboard and just what that has done for them personally and professionally, but also
Right.
that they've found. And the reason I wanted to mention them was that not only are they taking inner city kids to these resorts, they're actually giving them the gear. So they're teaching them how to snowboard. They are giving them a ride. So it's a free shuttle. Everything is free for these students. What
Cool.
they have to do is, make sure that they are getting good grades and that
Yeah,
they
sure.
their parents, but they have been able to find the support. And it really started out by them driving them themselves in their own
Uh,
personal vehicles and actually putting
yeah.
in finances to support giving these opportunities to these young kids. And they've been around, I can't remember how many years now. I want to say just over a decade that
Oh,
they've,
wow. Okay.
but it's just amazing. And I thought, I always wonder, as someone who does ski now, I didn't learn to ski until I was in my late 20s. I always wonder, and it's changed my life. Honestly, it's a big part of my life now, why I live where I live. But
Yeah.
I can't help but wonder, what if I had been given that opportunity when I was much younger? Who knows where I would be now and how that might have shaped my life? But same thing we talked about first time visiting public lands is how profound that experience was for us. And just the peace and the healing that we've found by being able to spend time in these spaces or the inspiration that they've given us. So I just want to shout out Hoods to Woods once again because
Love
they're
it.
such good work. And it's the same thing. They've, had kids who have graduated who have returned as mentors, who are
Oh,
volunteering as part of the organization, but are adding to the community of these places that were once not welcoming or accessible for people who come from those backgrounds. So I do want to add that there's that work being done, and they're not the only organization. There are
right.
others, but at the same time, that's unfortunately it's not common, and it's something that is just now starting to occur more so in the last 5, 10 years. Something that I don't remember seeing with when I was growing up, other than if I, was attending a school that was near a museum, or
Sure.
I happened to be going to school 2 hours away from Yosemite, so I was able to go on a field trip to that location. But that's not always the case for everyone.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I know we're getting close to the end here, but I think one of the things I wanted to do is kind of just define public space because it can mean so
Mhm.
many different things to different people, right? And I think I'll use us as an example, Deja. So when I met you, you were so excited to go ski, right, and snowboard and all that. And then I think someone asked me, they're like, "Are you gonna go ski?" I'm like, "No, man, that's not what I do." I'm like, "I'm gonna go to town. I'm gonna take cool like photos of the mountains, and I'm gonna frolic around, okay? Because
And
I'm not
that's
getting yeah, because I'm not getting my shoes dirty, right? And then there's people like they're like, yeah, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna hike around the Grand Canyon. I'm like, have fun. I'm not doing that, right? But it's just the opportunity to be in this whatever that space means to you, right? I was sharing with you before we started recording. I my life slows down when I go to places like Wyoming, places like Grand Teton, where I find as you mentioned, there's like such a I've been able on only visiting a couple of times. I've found such a incredible community there, communities, right? Of just really, really some of the best people I've ever met. I've ever met. And and that's for me slowing down and just taking the moment because there you kind of have to slow down, right? And kind of see what's in front of you and listen and kind of take this all in. I find that mentally I start just changing, right? And that can be in a place, a big open space. That can be an urban park, right? And I saw a lot of that in DC with Latinx communities who, I met a lot of these people at restaurants and places that I worked at. Um, and for a lot of people that I met, and I'm not just talking about an entire group of people, just from certain individuals and families, how for them green space meant going to a park and having a picnic and grilling out, right? And that was kind of their weekly public land kind of getaway, right? Um, and I think accessibility to that is critically important. Meaning, some of those park pavilions had requirements to get reservations online. Do all people know that, right? Is You know, can someone explain that to them? Right? Is there a person that can explain this to them? Is there a person willing to explain that to them? And I know there were, you know, there were, verbal arguments between people over picnic areas, right? And it was just over miscommunication or people not understanding, right? And that's something that when I think about equity, I think about that, right? Is that you can live anywhere and you can go into a place and feel secure, find whatever that you need there, right? If it's a picnic table, it's a grill, it's a trail, it can be a visitor center, it could be a museum, right? It could be any of that thing. It's a place to walk your dog, right? Um, that for me is the importance of public lands, right? That it's open literally for everyone, right? So that's how I wanted to kind of end this on. And because I know, we met in, the backdrop of the mighty Tetons, but I think of so many different shapes and forms of as public lands. And as I said, it's kind of a mental thing as well, right? It's in your mind, it's in your soul, and it's something that can bring people together. And I truly believe that.
Mm, thank you, Steve. I appreciate you elaborating on that because that has crossed my mind too. And you say public lands or public spaces, and there's even places like beaches,
Yeah.
I appreciate that there has been this initiative, especially in urban spaces, to create more green spaces. But
Right.
uh, I can't help but think that's because it's important to everyone and anyone, no matter what your background is, no matter, what your ethnicity or cultural background, no matter how you choose to connect with that space, whether you are hiking in the backcountry,
Right.
you're out surfing, or you just want to take some pretty pictures and just appreciate the view. There's no right or wrong way to spend
No,
time.
not at all. Right.
We all deserve to explore how we want to connect and to be able to take something away from it. And that's just something that, again, it's innately human.
It
It's
is.
the space and it's important to us mentally, emotionally, and physically. There's been, I think that's something that came out especially after COVID and during the pandemic, was the lack of being able to spend time outside affected us, right? Affected our
Right.
levels, but it also affected our mental health. It's so important to us and our just survival as a species in general. So thank you for touching on that. And oh, Steve, we can talk
I
forever.
know. I know.
So
Well,
much.
I think, as I said, we met and worked together for a week, and I know we've become close confidants now. And you know, it's as I said, for me, it's the human condition that I find so much inspiration in, right? And um, the work that you're doing and the impact that you're having on lives is so important in organizations too, right? And just as I said, you say truth. I call it, it's your vibe. I mean, I think it's incredible, right? And so I just, for us, we're kind of we're uniquely different people, but there's things that we have shared interests and things like that. And it was, like you spent the entire day on the mountain. I'm like, no, I'm gonna go shopping. Okay, it was, and then I'll meet you at, I'll meet you in the evening time. And that's exactly how it worked, right?
Yeah.
And and that's what that's why this is so special, right? And that's why, I mean, that's literally this public land initiative, in many ways, engagement brought us together as professionals, right? And it brings us together tonight, and will moving forward. So um I appreciate your time and inviting me to be a part of this. Keep keep doing you and keep inspiring. You're one of a kind.
Steve, I can't say thank you enough for you just being you, for you existing, period. And I'm so thankful that our paths crossed. Like I said, I feel like there was this kinship connection between us that was just on
Right.
a level immediately once we met. And the more that we got to know each other that week, I felt like I'd known you for much longer. So you keep also doing the good work. And I can't help but think, there's a reason why you're feeling this this instability or this feeling of uneasiness in where you're at, and whatever that means, whether that's like the physical location or what you're doing for work, whatever, however you're
Sure.
spending your time. I hope that you lean into that because there's a reason that you're feeling this pull. And I don't know where that's going to guide you, but I know you're going to end up where you're meant to because you continue to have this introspection and you continue to think about what is important to you. And so I'm excited to see where your path ends up taking you. And I'm just thankful to be a part of that journey in some way. I do want to say once again, thank you. And I know this isn't the end of us having these
Of course
discussions.
not. Yes.
I'll have you back for more. I know we can talk about so much more, and we already touched on so many different other avenues that we can go on. But before we wrap up officially, is there any last comments or thoughts that you want to add before I let you go?
Well, I appreciate that. Obviously, I want to reciprocate that expression of friendship and hope as well to you and everything that you're doing as well. No, I would say obviously grateful and honored to be here, and I hope um, to people listening, it's not just us that we want you to hear from. We want to hear from you as well, right? And if you can find any sort of meaning in this, um, that that's inspiring to us. I know that's why Deja, created this podcast, right? And just know that you're not alone, and that your story and um, your perspective, um, your space matters. And as you navigate in the public land spaces or wherever you may go, that yeah, you're not alone, and hope to hear your voice and your perspective as well. And so I think you may be listening, but you know, you also have the right to share who you are and what you find inspiration in. And I hope that this can be just one of the things that helps amplify that. So thank you so much.
Oh, Steve, gosh, you're gonna make me tear up. I can't help but think too that we'll end on the note that that idea, that phrase, just live your truth. And I can't help but think that that's how you ended up and where you're at and on the path that you've been on, doing the work that you're doing, is that you kept leaning into what was important to you and what felt good to you at your soul, at the heart. And that's how we were able to cross paths. So I hope other people take that away from your story, just continue to live their truth, and that it's never gonna guide them in the wrong direction. So thanks again, Steve.
Love you. Talk to you soon. Okay.
I appreciate you. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to more discussions.
Take care. Cheers.
Ah, what an amazing episode and conversation with Steve. That conversation with Steve reminds me to continue to live my truth, to show up unapologetically and authentically as someone can who carries with them this intersectionality of identities. And although we cannot always control what happens to us, we can control how we respond to situations. Thank you, Steve, for joining me in this fifth installment of Black and Wild, the podcast. And for those listening, stay tuned for more episodes published monthly. Be sure to show this channel some love by sharing it with your community too. Thanks. See you next time.